Hello, everyone. Hi, this is welcome to the podcast expert interview where we dive into the biggest stories shaping our world today. I'm Miko Santos, and this episode we're tackling one of the most pressing global trade issue about President Trump's sweeping tariff on a foreign import. So it's another live show again because we're trying to go on live because it's an election time, so we have to do election watch. So hopefully you enjoy our episode, and thank you so much for our subscriber, our free subscriber and paid subscriber on the show that continue helping us to do our work. To our Substack subscriber, by the way, I still have no access on the RTMP access, so after the show, we're gonna post that on the Substack platform so that you can watch the replay. But if you are on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, we are live today, and you can watch it, the expert interview on that platform. All right. So today it's hot, very hot issue today that to help us break down the impact of this tariff on global markets and Australia economy. We have our guest for today is Professor Robert Brooks, a professor of econometrics and business statistics at the Monash Business School. His expertise lies on the economic impact of tariff and how these measures affect industry like agribusiness. Please welcome to the show Professor Robert Brooks. Hello, Professor. How are you today? Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Miko. Thank you for having me, and I hope you're having a great afternoon as well.
Thank you so much for that. It's very big issue today about this lot of tariff for uh, President Trump just released all the figures about this. My first question to you, Professor, is giving your analysis that this direct that the direct impact of this Trump tariff on Australia's economy may be minimal. Could you elaborate on the specific indirect effects that might arise, especially if Australia engaged in this in reciprocal trade measure?
Sure. Yeah. So thanks, Miko. So I think the direct impact is minimal. I mean, that's not to say that there won't be an impact on particular industries, but the direct impact on the overall Australian economy is minimal. Now, where we have an indirect impact risk is really in three broad areas. So the first of those is this question of what will the rest of the world do in response? So will we see other countries, retaliate with reciprocal tariffs? Or will we see other countries not retaliate? That will be really important because to the extent that people retaliate, that then creates a much greater pressure on the world economy. The second issue that's particularly acute from an Australian perspective is that there's a lot of countries in Asia that have had, comparatively much higher tariffs imposed on them. And we know those Asian economies have been really important for Australia, and we know they're really important trading partners for us. And so any effect on their growth and global growth is potentially a risk. And the third dimension of the risk is what does it do about US inflation and about US economic growth? So they're the three areas where we have a big indirect exposure, in addition to the direct exposure for particular industries.
So that's gonna be a little bit. So there's three option and that gonna be impact on this. So how might the potential tit for tat trade wars damage, say, the global economic growth?
So we know the history of these global trade wars has been really problematic. So when we know countries got into, tit for tat retaliation, that was really bad. So the very strong historical example of that comes from the 1930s when the US passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff measures. And what happened at that stage was significant retaliation. And, on a lot of estimates, US trade dropped by close to 2/3 as a result of those measures. And it also made it much harder for all the economies of the world to get out of the challenge of the Great Depression. And so we do know if you get into tit for tat retaliation that it can be really bad. Now, what's interesting, I think, from what's been discussed a bit today is we've clearly got some countries talking about retaliation, but we've also got other countries talking about alternative markets. And so I think that question of will people diversify away from the US and still maintain significant global trade is going to be an important issue.
I see earlier the um, Prime Minister Albanese, they try to diversify their, I think the other one, they said they're talking to in the Middle East about something trade while this Trump tariff is being considered. Do you think it's a good move from the Australian government to look into other alternative markets about this?
Yes, so alternative markets and access to those markets is actually a really important response, particularly for the agricultural and agribusiness products that are caught up. And, one of the big pluses of the Australian setting for a long time has been to argue about the quality of Australian produce and the quality of a lot of Australian agricultural produce, and to try and get, a premium associated with that. Now, we know at the minute, with certain products like beef, for example, that Australia for beef and other agricultural products doesn't have the market access into Europe that would be desirable. That's clearly an important issue that needs to be taken up. But that always takes time. And then there is a need then to think about alternative markets in other parts of the world. Now, what we do know is as markets develop, you tend to get demand for a lot more proteins in people's diets. So there are other market access opportunities, but there is some short-term challenge there.
I was looking on this because I received a press release from Farmers for Climate Action, and they are saying they are very disappointed about this tariff, the 10% tariff on tax on Australian beef and other farm produce, and they claiming that American Big Macs, they might be the price can be go up because of this. What do you think about this?
Yes, look, I think that's a perfectly reasonable view to take. I mean, the reality of the tariffs is that it will be US consumers that will pay more for their goods. Now, the firms in the US are going to have to think, can they absorb part of the tariff in reduced profit margins, or are we going to get what happens often where the costs of the tariffs flow through really strongly to consumers? So I think that critique that it is going to cost US consumers is a reasonable and accurate one.
Beyond the financial support, what measure can the government take to assist agribusiness in adapting to these new trade barriers? Because it's going to be affected, the agribusiness.
Yes, so there clearly is effects, particularly for things that, for which the US are a really important market at the minute. So market access is really important. The areas where we've got existing free trade agreements and liberalised trade arrangements are, good markets in terms of access. There are a whole series of other market access pieces that the government needs to work on. There's sort of an interesting question because, lots of the rest of the world's also been impacted by these tariffs, and in some cases at tariff rates a lot higher than we're experiencing. Potentially that has the ability to sort of unlock some of those more market access discussions as people look at alternative trading partners. market access is important. The question on, to what extent are you able to sell a more premium product? And a portion, particularly of Australian, beef exports has been at that more premium end of the market, and that the premium material is really, really important. Some of the wine companies have been out, talking today around the potential effects on the sales of Australian wine. And what does that mean? And what does that mean in terms of the set of vineyards that they have access to? So I think at that more premium end, the market access is going to be really important. So that's a key role for government. There clearly is a key advocacy role around, putting the case very strongly that having measures that liberalise more trade is a desirable thing. So I think there's an advocacy piece there as well. And there has been an announcement of some support measures, while a number of these issues are worked through. And again, that's really important, I think. So that's all of those things are worthwhile doing, and this just provides, some additional catalyst to them being done.
Thank you for that. In light of Australia's firm stance on maintaining strict biosecurity measures, and how can the nation balance this standard with the need to preserve and expand the export market, particularly in the face of U.S. tariff? Because on the press conference of President Donald Trump, it's specifically they very pissed off with the because of their beef not able to come to the Australia.
Yes, so we are aware of that's clearly an issue that they've raised. So look, biosecurity is extremely important. As anyone who's in Australia for a period of time, or who anyone travel knows, biosecurity is a really important part of the Australian environment, quality of life, and the quality of those agricultural products. So biosecurity is always one of these things that has to be non-negotiable. And I think to be clear on that, all politics in Australia has come out today and they earlier this week and today and been really strong on how, biosecurity is not negotiable. So there's partly a discussion about that happens. But, there is always a question, and I don't think this applies in the setting of what Australia's doing. There is always a question around, whether these biosecurity and health measures are essential biosecurity and health measures, or whether they are non-tariff barriers. Now, the US assertion in the announcements is that this is a non-tariff barrier that they're concerned about. But, Australia has to be very strong on its biosecurity position, and to think through, being very clear on why that's important. I suspect that's not going to change the views of people in the US who think that concern is overstated, but I think that's an issue where you have to be very firm, and it has actually been really good that everyone in political life in Australia that's spoken on that has been really firm about why that's essential.
Thank you for that. On the list of I saw the table where President Donald Trump showed to the media. Number one is China. What role does China economic growth play in the context of escalating trade tension, and how could this affect Australia?
Yeah, so the China issue is really, really interesting one, I think. So it is very clear that China has been, a focus of US trade policy, and it is clear that the US has been concerned for a period of time about its trade balance with China, and it's also clear that China's ability to trade has been a significant part of economic growth in China. Now, all the Chinese products going to the US are going there, and US consumers are buying them because they see them as desirable products to have. And the question around trade balances is one that the US has advocated on a lot, but ultimately the US trade balance is a function also of what happens in capital markets as well, and it's a function of what happens with the savings investment profile in the US. So there is a risk around how the Chinese economic response is. There is a risk around what it might say for economic growth in China, because we know economic growth in China is a really important matter for Australia and Australian exports and the health of the Australian economy. So I think the policy response of China will be really interesting. But I think all the evidence is that, the Chinese economic policy settings remain as seeing economic growth as really important. And in the same way that Australia will be thinking about market access issues, China will be similarly thinking about market access issues more broadly and its engagement with the rest of the world. But that China response and what happens to economic growth in China is clearly an important issue.
So let's just wait and see about that. What's gonna be happening?
Yes, and hopefully, there are signs about a lot of countries talking more positively about alternative markets and still being committed to trade. That is really important.
Yes, I guess we're just gonna wait and see on that. How do you foresee this current trade tension and tariff implementation influencing Australia on long-term economic relationship with the key partners like US, China, and EU?
Sure, that's a really good question, Kate. So Australia is fundamentally a trading nation, and being a trading nation is really important to Australia's growth and to Australia's prosperity. So we've had a long period of time, really, since the end of the Second World War, where there's been a commitment to freer global trade. Initially very multilateral through the GATT and the WTO arrangements, but in more recent times as well through countries working through specific free trade type arrangements. The question is always, can we work through what that response is and get more liberalised trade? To what extent is the US policy how permanent, I guess, is the US policy setting is really interesting. I think the macroeconomic risk potentially is around higher inflation in the US. If we get higher inflation and lower growth in the US, then US macroeconomic policy settings become more complex. And then I think we also have the complexity of, what does that mean about exchange rates and the like? That's really a difficult prediction as we sit here today. But the US economic policy settings are potentially more complex now because they potentially have to deal with both lower growth and higher inflation. To the extent that the rest of the world doesn't engage in retaliation, it has less inflationary pressure, but it still potentially has a growth shock. So I think Australia will do the piece around, the market access and that broader advocacy on the importance of trade.
That's interesting, Professor Brooks. What policy recommendation would you offer to the Australian government to, say, mitigate potential negative impact of this tariff while capitalizing on any emerging opportunities in alternative market?
Yeah, so the economic policy settings, I think, become really interesting. Oh my God! So I think it's been very good so far that the Australian government and the opposition, to be fair as well, neither of them have talked about retaliation as an appropriate response. We don't have a view of we need to retaliate against these tariffs, and I think that's desirable because all retaliation means is that consumers in Australia are going to pay more on US products. So that's clearly not a desirable state of affairs. Australia policy settings has to be around, the advocacy of trade in both a multilateral setting, and I think Europe and Asia are both going to be extremely important for that. The government has to think about what it does in a piece around assistance to industries that may have been affected, and our important matters are always to make sure that our macroeconomic policy settings remain strong. So we have to remain in an environment where we wish to keep inflation at a low level, and we have to be in an environment where we keep economic growth and employment where we want it to be. So I think it's really important to make sure that the macro policy settings continue to work along those dimensions.
Thank you for that. From an econometric standpoint, Professor, what models or methodologies would you suggest to accurately forecast the economic impact of this tariff on Australian various sectors, especially the agribusiness?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, Mikhail. So most of the models that think about trade are trying to think about, if you think about a lot of the agricultural products, it's thinking about what do you think's happening with growth in those countries. So the one thing you want to try and get some prediction on is what happens to growth. We know for some agricultural products that it's not just growth in the country you're exporting to that matters, it's what the income distribution in that country looks like. And it's been this sort of, rise in rise in incomes in the middle class in a lot of countries. So you also have to think about, do you get any distribution effects of these policies? Those distribution effects are probably unlikely from these policies, and they're part of sort of longer demographic and economic trends in those countries. The growth rate one is the big issue, and what policies do other countries pursue is the big issue. And then I think you sort of got any sort of modelling and predicting on this has got to be scenario based. It's got to think through, what's the best case version of this and what's the worst case version of this, and how far apart are we? What does that then mean about the contingencies that you might want to adopt in managing through some of those issues? So they will be the things that are being thought about. So, at a macroeconomic level, that's clearly important for government, Treasury and the Reserve Bank. At an industry level, that's important for the relevant departments looking after the particular industries and the industry associations. And then ultimately at the individual firm or the individual producer level, they're going to have to think what that means. What they will want to do is understand that and think about means what support and what investment do they make in market access. Getting these precise is really complex. The US is clearly, if we take the US statement that these are reciprocal against other trade barriers, you have to have a pretty sophisticated and deep understanding to be able to calibrate this as precisely as the US would seem to have claimed to be done. And so that's interesting that you would think you can do that at that level of precision.
Yeah. How might the US tariff action influence global trade dynamics, and what role can Australia play in advocating for free and fair trade in international forums?
Yes. So it is clear that that the tariffs are clearly going to reduce trade with the US. That I think is a given. The question around do we get into retaliation will ask about how global that becomes. Australia's role is to advocate for a freer trading system and to get more market access and to get more barriers removed. And I think the the opportunity that sits in all of this is where the other impacted countries are saying, look, okay, we have to do something about the US. Now, okay, perhaps we might want to do some tit for tat style retaliation, but also what are we doing about market access? So Australia has to play the role that it's played, for a very long time under governments of different political persuasion. One of the great Australian success stories has been in that more liberal trading environment, and I think we have to keep doing that and keep pushing on the market access points, and not get dragged into the risk of being in a retaliatory measures type point. Remember, it's US consumers that are going to wear the cost of this. Some of our producers, clearly in impacted sectors, have a cost while we work through what those alternatives might look like. But to the extent that we don't similarly impact Australian consumers, we're in a better place to be able to respond to that.
Thank you so much for that. My last question, Professor Brooke, is that looking ahead, how can Australia strengthen its trade relationship and diversify its export market to reduce dependency on any single country, thereby mitigating risks associated with such tariff policy?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So, we've clearly got to get back to thinking about what our relationship with the EU is, and working through those arrangements that had been talked about for a period of time, but have had some delays and stalls with them. We've clearly got to work through our relationships across a lot of really important markets in Asia as well. So I think it's really very, very important. I've lost you temporarily.
All right. Thank you for that, Professor Brooke, for your time. And let's see what's going to be happening on the next few days about this tariff war.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, and it's been lovely chat with you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for that. That's wrap up for today. So that's wrap up our discussion on Trump tariff and their impact on global trade. And a huge thank you to Professor Robert Brooke for sharing his insight about this. From shifting the trade alliance to potential economic ripple effect, it's clear that this policy will shape global market for years to come. The big question remains, how will countries, including Australia, adapt to this evolving trade landscape? Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the expert interview for more in-depth discussion on the latest economic and political development. You can also find more on analysis from our expert on redmencarry.com. Thank you for tuning in and watching. And thank you to Professor Brooke from Monash University for his time. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.